Okay, we're going to continue reading The Liberation of Gabriel King. I'm on page 94. We're at chapter 16, Persevering Through a Fine Dinner. And if you remember yesterday, they jumped off of the swing, the rope swing. There's nothing like success to boost your confidence. At least that's what Frida said after the rope swing. That made sense, only I wondered if confidence were the same thing as courage. We jumped off the rope swing 5 more times after the 6th graders left. But I still didn't want to go to the 5th grade. But Frida didn't seem to notice that part. She was too excited. The way things are going, Frida said, we'll be completely liberated by the bicentennial. We were sitting in her bedroom drawing pictures and listening to her transistor radio. It was shaped like a plastic spaceship, and we had to adjust the antenna to get the music to come in. I pushed it all the way over to the side like I was working at fixing it. But really, I was thinking. You decide which fireworks you're going to, I asked. Frida gave me a look like she hardly knew what I was talking about. Hollowell, she said. Where else? I wondered when she made up her mind, but I didn't ask because I didn't ask because that was the one I wanted her to pick. Remember, she wanted to go to where there'd be more people of color, and so she wanted to go to, I don't remember the town's name, but she wanted to go to another town to watch the fireworks. We gonna stay up all night in the tent afterward, Frida asked. I've been waffling on the decision. That means like deciding. Last year we tried to stay up all night, but I got scared on account of what had sounded like a black bear, but turned out to be a raccoon. After that, I had to go inside and sleep with Mama. Maybe, I said, and Frida put both of her hands on her hips. Gabriel King, she said, you got to use some perseverance. I wasn't so sure what perseverance was all about, so Frida tried to explain. It's pushing on, she said, toward the high mark. That was part of a hymn we sang in church, and I wondered if Frida really knew what perseverance meant or if she was just making it up. Then I thought about all the things I needed and how there were so many of them. Courage, integrity, faith, confidence, perseverance. Sure would be easier to sit back with my feet up and maybe eat a snack. Frida got up and put her drawing away. What have you got left on your list? She asked, pulling out the special shoebox from under the bed where we kept it. I took out my list and read over everything real careful. There were a bunch of fears that we hadn't crossed off yet, but I wanted to pick the easiest one. Only this time Frida didn't wait. She plucked the list right out of my hands. Let me read it, she said, climbing onto her bed. It's almost done anyway. Then before I could stop her, she started reading it out loud. Number 1, 5th grade. Number 2, Duke Evans. Number 3, Frankie Carmen. Number 4, spiders. Number 5, alligators. Number 6, Terrence. Frida stopped reading. Terrence? I sure wish I wouldn't have written that one down. You're scared of Terrence? No, I thought, even though I was lying. That's her brother. You wrote it down, she said. Once you write something down, it's true. It's not, it's to, not. That's when Miss Wilson came in. You kids getting along, she asked. I glared at Frida, so she knew she'd better not breathe a word of this to her mama. She paused and handed me back my list, but then she said, can Gabe stay for dinner? Miss Wilson nodded. She never said no when it came to feeding me because she had the idea that Mama didn't feed me enough. And Miss Wilson did serve more food than Mama. When Mama served dinner, there was always 3 things. Sometimes it was pork chops, green beans, and applesauce, or else it was mac and cheese, peas, and bread. But it was always 3, and one of them was always a vegetable. So that meant there were only 2 things that counted. When Miss Wilson made dinner, she made about 10 things. There'd be some sort of meat, and then a couple of vegetables, so a body could choose what was the most tolerable. And then there'd be cornbread, mashed potatoes, rice, and beans. Miss Wilson was a good cook. You can stay if your mother says it's okay, Miss Wilson said. Why don't you call her? I jumped off the bed, real excited, but then I stopped. It occurred to me that there was probably a reason Frida was inviting me to dinner, and it probably had to do with Terrence. I had to weigh everything real careful. What are you making for dinner? I asked. Miss Wilson was hanging up some of Frida's clothes in the closet, but she stopped and turned around surprised. I never asked what she was making for dinner before. Corned beef, some collard greens, a bit of okra, cornbread, a little bit of brown rice, applesauce. Oh, and I've made bread pudding with the sweet brandy sauce for dessert. That all right with you, Gabe? She was smiling like something was kind of funny, but she didn't laugh. I could never resist bread pudding. All right, I said at last. Miss Wilson turned her back around. Oh, good, she said. Is Terrence coming to dinner tonight? Frida asked, real sweet. Miss Wilson turned around again and put one hand on her hip. As Frida would say, it was common knowledge that everyone at the Wilson household would come to dinner every night, no matter what. What are you 2 up to? Miss Wilson asked, real suspicious. Nothing, Frida said. Then she grabbed my arm. Come on, Gabe, let's call your mama so we can go outside before dinner. What are you going to do? I asked Frida when we were outside knocking moss off the tree with 2 big sticks. I was real nervous, so I kept missing. Nothing, Frida said. I'm just going to make sure you and Terrence get to talk. Mom always says things be all right if black people and white people could just sit down and talk over a fine dinner. I stopped swinging at the moss. Huh? I sure hadn't thought about me and Terrence as black people and white people. I thought of us about as big, poundy, scary person and a little wimpy person who doesn't get pounded. Who doesn't want to get pounded. The way Frida put it, it made it seem like it was a big deal, and that couldn't be good. By the time Miss Wilson called us to dinner, I was wishing I had said no, even if we were having bread pudding. Then we went inside to wash our hands. Terrence was already at the sink, only he wasn't standing right next to it. So when me and Frida ran in full blast, we took his spot. Terrence narrowed his eyes. Twerps, he growled. He stormed out of the bathroom. I gulped, and Frida looked over at me. He don't mean anything. Maybe, I thought, or maybe not. Frida went into the dining room and sat down with her daddy, who was just taking off his tie and stretching his long legs under the table. Hello there, beautiful, he said to Frida. Then he turned to me. Gabriel, he said, nodding as I pulled my chair. Hello, Mrs. Wilson, he said when Mrs. Wilson brought out the corned beef. She leaned over and put the tray down, and he kissed her cheek. She smiled and said, hello, Mr. Wilson, like it was some sort of inside joke between the two of them. Me and Frida reached for the cornbread and the collard greens and started passing stuff around. We had everything all passed before Terrence even came to the table. Miss Wilson scowled because he was late, and she didn't even say anything. I took a deep breath before launching into my meal, and it was a good thing I did because I forgot about the prayer. When you eat dinner at the Wilsons, there was always a prayer, and it was always a long one. Mr. Wilson started at slow, but then he got into it. His voice would start sounding like a song. Miss Wilson would say, Well, Mr. Wilson prayed. And the whole time, we'd be holding hands around the table. I was sure glad I didn't have to hold hands with Terrence. By the time the prayer was over, my mouth was watering something fierce. I took a bite of cornbread immediately after Mr. Wilson said amen. Frida scraped her collard greens into a pile under her cornbread so that it looked like she'd eaten them. Terrence, Gabe wants to know what your favorite color is, Frida asked out of nowhere after he'd all been eating a bit. I nearly choked in my okra, and Terrence made a face. What business is it of his? Mr. Wilson scowled. Terrence, tell the boy your favorite color, he said. Won't hurt you to be civil, Miss Wilson was shaking her head like she was some fed up. Terrence paused sarcastic like. Then he said, black. What's yours, white? I paused too. No, I said, it's blue mostly, but sometimes green when I can't make up my mind. Terrence laughed like I said something stupid, and Frida picked her cornbread, so he said the black and white thing. We all went back to eating again, but not for long. Gabe wants to know what your hobbies are, Frida said, as if the last question hadn't been enough. This time, Terrence's face twisted up like squash vine. Why doesn't the twerp ask me himself? Mrs. Wilson glared. Don't you speak to your guest that way, she said. I just sat there looking from Frida to Terrence to Mrs. Wilson. I was sinking lower and lower into my chair, and that was hard to do because the Wilsons' chairs were the wooden kind with the straight backs. Mostly I ended up hunched under the table. I kicked Frida underneath it. Ouch! Miss Wilson gave the two of us the evil eye, and I knew we better hurry up and ask something quick before everyone got mad. Do you have your driver's license, I asked. I already knew the answer. That was the only thing I could think of. Terrence sat back in his chair, but he put one arm over the empty chair next to him and eyed me real cold. He hardly eaten a thing. You want to know what I do for fun, he asked, ignoring the question about the driver's license. I nodded, even though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know. I fight oppression, Terrence said. You know what that is, twerp? The funny thing was, this time Terrence didn't say it mean. He said it like maybe he really wanted to know if I knew what oppression was. I thought maybe I did. I know, I said, nodding. Once I found a stray dog, and Pop wouldn't let me keep it. I was real oppressed about that because I thought Pop might say yes. So oppress is oppression when you keep people down, and Gabe's thinking depressed. Miss Wilson laughed into her napkin. She was trying not to, but I could tell what she was doing. Miss Wilson smiled too, but Terrence got real mad. What? Terrence said. What kind of stupid answer is that? Miss Wilson looked at Terrence like he was saying something serious with his eyes. Then he turned to me. Gabe, he said, it's not your fault you don't know what oppression is. White people don't always teach their kids about oppression because they don't think they have to know about it. But that's not the case, is it? We all need to know what oppression is, or how else will we fight it? I swallowed hard. Yes, sir, I said, even though I still didn't know what I gotten wrong about it. Mr. Wilson set down his fork. Oppression is when you're put down, he said. It's when you don't have the freedom to be who you want to be because someone else doesn't believe you should have that freedom. Oppression is one person keeping down another person because of the color of his skin, or the language he speaks, or the religion he practices. Mr. Wilson was starting to sound like a preacher again. He was getting louder and taking up a rhythm like he did when he was praying. It was like being at church, only I was getting my own personal sermon. I listened real careful and tried to think of what Mr. Wilson was talking about. At first, I didn't know, but then I remembered Pop's story about Jimmy Carter and the white Citizens Council. Only this time I thought about it in a different way from how I thought about it the first time. This time, instead of thinking about what happened to Jimmy Carter, I thought about what it must have felt like for the black people in the plains who had a whole group forming against them. I felt that they were some oppressed, and they must have had to be real brave. I told that to Mr. Wilson. He looked surprised. Gaby said, "That's exactly right." He looked at Terrence across the table, but Terrence only snorted like he didn't care what I said. Miss Wilson cut me an extra piece of cornbread. "I think we got ourselves another peace warrior," she said, winking at Mr. Wilson. "No one ever called me that my whole entire life. I wondered if a chicken could really become a warrior," but Frida grinned like it was already true. "You can join our group," she told me, "just like me and Terrence." I looked at Terrence, but he didn't look too excited about the idea. He got up from the table and took his plate into the kitchen. "Can I be excused?" he said. But this was after he'd already gotten up and then left, even though Mrs. Wilson didn't answer. She sighed. "Don't mind him," she said, dishing everyone some more corned beef. I stared down the hallway where Terrence had disappeared, but Miss Wilson poked me in the stomach. "A warrior's got to eat," he said. Mr. Wilson poked me in the stomach. "A warrior's got to eat," he said with his mouth full. It was okay, because I suspected Miss Wilson was a warrior too. Mr. Wilson was a warrior too, and sometimes warriors have to talk with their mouths full.